Hey Green Drone AZ, welcome to Module 6, Remote Sensing and UAV Collected Data, Lesson 1, an Introduction to Remote Sensing. It's me, Justin Ettinger, again from NAU. Really looking forward to taking you guys through this presentation all about remote sensing. So in this presentation, we'll answer the question, what is remote sensing? Talk about some of its basic uses, cover some of the basics of aerial imagery, characteristics of imagery, how we can use those characteristics to extract information from imagery, and talk about some of the differences between UAV or drone and satellite imagery. So remote sensing is the process of detecting and monitoring the physical characteristics of an area by measuring its reflected and emitted radiation at a distance. Right? Typically from a satellite or aircraft. There's your USGS, United States Geological Survey definition of remote sensing. So it's the acquisition of information without making physical contact. And the really cool thing about remote sensing is it gives us the ability to explore and analyze places and factors that would otherwise wouldn't really be accessible to us. So let's say I'm curious about ice melt in Antarctica. Well, getting myself all the way down there and onto a Nat Geo research vessel presents some serious obstacles. But thanks to remote sensing and satellite imagery, with the click of a few buttons, I can start to explore that curiosity and begin to answer some of those burning questions. And there are two different types of instruments or sensors used in remote sensing: passive instruments and active instruments. Passive instruments detect natural energy, most commonly sunlight that is reflected or emitted from a surface, whereas active instruments provide their own energy and detect the reflected or returned energy of an area of interest. A very popular use of active instruments is found in something called LiDAR, or light detection and ranging. A LiDAR sensor emits a laser pulse and records the backscatter that is returned to the sensor. In this fashion, it can map the surface of an area and everything that exists on that surface, such as vegetation or buildings. This technology is commonly used in self-driving cars. Those sensors we see attached to, say, the Waymo cars, they're constantly sending pulses and mapping the environment around them. All of that collected data is part of the algorithm that allows the car to safely operate on the road. And here's a simple diagram that displays the difference between active and passive sensors. Here we see the passive sensor capturing energy in the form of sunlight reflectance off the Earth's surface, whereas the active sensor is sending its own pulse of energy and recording the feedback returned from the surface. I came across this explanation on GISgeography.com and I thought it made it really clear. So a passive sensor would be like using a handheld camera without a flash, right? You're depending on the natural lighting to illuminate your source. Whereas an active sensor is like using that same handheld camera but with the flash turned on. So that flash is illuminating the target and the camera is measuring the reflected energy that is traveling back to it. There's really a wide range of remote sensing applications, from analysis of infrastructure, base map reference, land cover change is a gigantic use of remote sensing, studying weather patterns and storm predictions, emergency management, archaeological exploration. There's a ton of them. So many that we've included a really cool resource in the extra resources for Module 6, and we encourage you to check that out. It is a link to 100 awesome ways that remote sensing can be utilized. Now, satellites are the most commonly used and reliable source to obtain aerial imagery. And we've been collecting satellite imagery for decades, so it provides a unique opportunity to study how the surface of the planet has changed over time. Other types of aerial imagery can be collected via aircraft. And that could be an airplane or helicopter, and more recently, can include a drone. And there's a plethora of uses for aerial imagery, such as mapping and analysis, sampling and modeling, again, backdrops and reference maps, assisting field work. Really, the key is to use imagery in such a way that we're able to extract information from it. Extracting information from imagery can also be referred to as image interpretation. Now, this can be performed by either a human user or by computers through machine learning and classification algorithms. So humans use a combination of image characteristics to interpret imagery. We can see those listed here on the left. And those characteristics are used to essentially make a decision that, yes, indeed, this is a tree and this is a car. Computers use algorithms based on rankings to make these decisions. So as humans, we can make complex decisions that a computer algorithm may not recognize. That being said, each person could interpret information differently that can lead to inconsistencies. So the biggest benefit to using computer programs to classify images is that they're very good at producing consistent and reproducible results, which is very important in science. So now we'll walk through each of those 7 characteristics of aerial imagery and discuss how we can use each characteristic to extract information or interpret that imagery. So both humans and computers can utilize differences in tone and color to interpret or extract information from imagery. For the human interpretation, we may recognize the green and associate that with vegetation, or the brown, tan color and associate it with bare ground. For the computer, they would isolate and organize the unique values associated with each pixel in that image to make decisions based on the classification of that imagery. Now, all features in an image have some form of shape to them. However, we can't always make decisions based on shape alone. So we can see on the left here, the same type of feature could have different shapes, like a mature cottonwood, which we see in the image on the left, compared to a juvenile tree. Likewise, different features can have relatively similar shape, like that of a small mesquite tree and a large creosote bush. You can see where shape alone wouldn't be enough to make decisions, but we can depend on other things, such as size. If we know the scale of the imagery that we're looking at, then we can take direct measurements or use our decision making to interpret the features. On the right, we see the same image showing mesquite trees and creosote bushes next to each other. With the proper background knowledge of these plants, we can interpret size differences to make our decision based on what species we're looking at. The image on the left is the same area, but depicts something referred to as a digital surface model, or DSM. This is an elevation model based on the height of objects above ground. So the brighter white, the taller the object. So again, here we can use those size differences to make decisions or determinations on what species of plant we're looking at. Similarly, we can use differences in texture to interpret imagery. Texture refers to the roughness or smoothness of a region in imagery. Here we can see the varying texture associated with different sections of the Lower Salt River Restoration Project, with a large stand of mesquite trees representing the coarse texture, a shrub known as arrowweed representing that medium texture, and a well-defined trail with very fine texture. Shadows cast by objects in imagery can give the interpreter important clues. Here on the left, we see the very distinguishable shadow of a saguaro cactus. Without that shadow, it would be easy to miss something like a cactus in aerial imagery due to the nature of the plant and the limited surface area visible from above. On the right, we see how shadows can help an interpreter distinguish between tree species. In this instance, the tighter, more rounded canopy shadow belongs to a cottonwood tree, while the more open, sparse canopy is that of a Gooding's willow. While there are certainly some that can be identified in the natural world, patterns are often a good indicator of human influence and are generally easy to spot in imagery. On the left here, we see some rock art on the Lower Salt River. While this isn't considered an archaeological artifact yet, you can imagine how an archaeologist might utilize remote sensing to locate artifacts or ruins. On the right, we can see a clearly distinguishable target. We use these targets to locate ground control points that help increase the accuracy of our drone imagery. Lastly, in natural resource management, we can use biological association to make inferences about what objects we are viewing. For instance, with some background knowledge of the plants on the Lower Salt River, I can associate the thick density of closely arranged salt cedar trees on the left and see how this vegetation strongly contrasts the sparser native vegetation on the right of the image. Similarly, in the image on the right of the slide, I can associate the close location on the river's edge with the preferred habitat of a plant commonly known as cattail. So as we walked through those characteristics, we saw the benefit each could provide. However, it's the combination or the convergence of all these factors that ultimately lead to a skilled interpreter making sound decisions, right? Because not any one of those factors may be enough to make a decision, but by combining several types of information to draw a conclusion, we can see how we can extract meaningful information from satellite or aerial imagery. Here we see the result of combining all the characteristics we discussed and our on-the-ground knowledge of the project site in the mapping of plant species on the Lower Salt River. And the information that we can extract from imagery is based on certain characteristics of that imagery, including spatial, spectral, temporal, and radiometric resolution. So next we'll discuss each of these characteristics in a bit of detail. The first characteristic we will discuss is spatial resolution, or the size of cells or pixels within the image. So each pixel in the image is a representation of measurement on the ground. The level of detail that we can see in imagery relies a lot on the spatial resolution of that image. We can see the difference here from the left to right, comparing the spatial resolution of Landsat 7 imagery, which is a satellite, with 30-meter resolution, meaning each pixel in that image represents 30 meters on the ground. 1-meter resolution from the National Agricultural Imagery Program, or NAPE imagery, which is collected via airplane. And on the far right there, our drone imagery collected on the Lower Salt River with 2.5 centimeter resolution. So at 30 meters, we're saying, yeah, I think I'm looking at vegetation. At 1 meter, that's pretty clear. But at 2.5 centimeters, not only can we identify what kind of vegetation it is, but we can see footprints in the sand. So depending on the information you're trying to extract, spatial resolution can be very important. For instance, if we're analyzing land cover change across a continent, then 30-meter resolution will provide more than enough detail. But let's say we're mapping gas lines. We can't be guessing that those lines exist somewhere within 30 meters. We need to know their precise location down to centimeters. Another characteristic is the spectral resolution of imagery. The spectral resolution refers to the size, number, and position of imaging bands being recorded. For example, most of the cameras we use only record visible bands of light, right? Red, green, and blue. But if we look here at the spectral signature of healthy vegetation, that green squiggly line, we can see that the visible spectrum only reveals part of the story. Additional information can be obtained from the non-visible portion of the spectrum. Multispectral imagery captures additional bands of light not visible to the naked eye. Individual bands or combination of these bands can be used to extract specific information. So while we see here that near-infrared is important in identifying healthy vegetation, shortwave infrared data can be used to identify hotspots and is therefore useful in locating active wildfires or volcanoes. Temporal resolution is often used to describe satellite imagery and refers to how often a sensor records imagery over a particular area. So for satellites, that's how long it takes a particular satellite to complete its orbit of Earth and return to the same spot, which is controlled by factors such as its orbital characteristics, the size of area being captured, and the number of satellites belonging to a certain family. Improved temporal resolution is one of the greatest benefits of drone imagery because you're getting a snapshot of that piece of land in real time, as opposed to waiting, say, 16 days for Landsat imagery or an entire year or more for imagery such as NAPE to be released. The last characteristic we will discuss is radiometric resolution, or the number of values that a sensor can discriminate for any band. Now this one's a little more in depth, no pun intended, than we need to go into for now. But just know that the greater the bit depth, the more values and therefore better discrimination of details that imagery can provide. However, this also equates to a larger file size. So we can see that the amount of information that we can extract from imagery using characteristics such as shape or size, tone, color, patterns and association, or texture is all dependent upon those characteristics of the imagery, including spatial resolution, spectral resolution, radiometric, and temporal resolution. So all of these characteristics come together to determine, what kind of information we can actually get, the quantity and quality of that information that can be interpreted from that imagery. And ultimately, it's the needs of your project that are going to determine what kind of imagery will best suit your project, whether that be satellite imagery, imagery collected via aircraft, or imagery collected via drone, right? So we can use this table to kind of make some simple comparisons between drone or UAV imagery and satellite imagery. So we can look first at spatial resolution. We saw the difference in spatial resolution in that imagery, and generally, while satellite imagery is readily available, its spatial resolution is going to vary in that range from 15 to 30 meters. Some satellite imagery has 10-meter resolution, but with drone imagery, we can drastically increase that spatial resolution right down to the centimeter level. Spectral resolution, so with drones, we can obviously collect red, green, and blue. We can collect multispectral and even hyperspectral, meaning hundreds of bands of light not visible to the naked eye. But those platforms are incredibly expensive, whereas satellite imagery collects all of that information in red, green, and blue bands of light, multispectral, and hyperspectral. And luckily, we don't have to pay for that directly out of our pocket. That imagery is being collected by that family of satellites and then hosted by whatever agency owns that data. Temporal resolution, the great thing about drone imagery is that your temporal resolution is going to be defined by the user, right? When do you want to collect that imagery and why? Whereas satellite or aircraft imagery, you're going to have to wait until that imagery is released. For satellite imagery, that could be days to weeks. For something like NAPE imagery that we discussed, again, is collected statewide via an airplane, but that imagery takes over a year to collect and process. So by the time the user gets it on the other side, it's basically over a year old. And the availability of both of these platforms, right, is going to help you make those decisions. So while drones can be expensive and require technical skills to obtain, satellite imagery is readily available and, like we said, for the most part free. So it's just going to depend kind of on what needs your project, require for the type of imagery that's going to work for you. And so why did Green Drone choose drone imagery? Well, the monitoring that we're doing on the Lower Salt River Restoration Project requires the ability to extract information at fine scale or detail, right? And aerial and satellite imagery didn't provide the spatial resolution that we needed to track small changes in vegetation populations. We couldn't wait months or even years for new imagery, right? So temporal resolution, being able to collect the imagery when it's meaningful to us and not just have to wait until that satellite or aerial imagery is released. And by the time that comes around, that imagery really isn't that useful to us because it's so old. Multispectral sensors are beneficial to us because we're really interested in classifying and mapping vegetation types, right? So that's spectral resolution. And besides that, it's awesome and it's fun, and I'll be honest, green satellite AZ just doesn't sound quite as cool. So to recap, remote sensing is all about the acquisition of information without making physical contact with an object, right? So extracting information from imagery. Module 6, Lesson 1 is all about understanding some of the basic characteristics of aerial imagery and how they allow us to use remote sensing to extract meaningful information. So in the exercises associated with this lesson, you'll get to see some of the differences hands-on, how spatial, temporal, and spectral resolution play a part in extracting information from imagery. And in Lesson 2, we'll focus in a little more on data collected via drone or UAV. So we'll look forward to catching up with you guys soon and enjoy the activities.